Okay, terrific. Thanks so much. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bonnie Kaplan and the Dr. Rogers Prize Lecture. The Dr. Rogers Prize for Excellence in Complementary and Alternative Medicine is pleased to sponsor this presentation by Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, the 2019 recipient of the prize. Awarded every 2 years to highlight the innovative contributions of complementary, alternative, and integrative approaches to healthcare, nominations for this $250,000 cash prize will open in February 2021. So for more information, please visit drrogersprize.org. Dr. Kaplan is currently semi-retired and is a professor emerita at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary. She first joined the faculty in the Department of Pediatrics. Later, she held a secondary appointment in the Department of Community Health Sciences. During her 40-year scientific career, she has published widely on the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly focusing on the contribution of nutrition to brain development and brain function. Originally from the United States, Ohio, she did all her training there, Butler University, University of Chicago, Brandeis University, including her postdoc training at West Haven, Connecticut, Veterans Administration Hospital Neuropsychology Lab, and then a research faculty appointment in the Department of Neurology at Yale University. She then moved to Alberta Children's Hospital and the University of Calgary and has now been a Canadian for more than half her life. In 2017, she was named one of the top 150 difference makers in Canada for the area of mental health. She has also recently been honored by being nominated for a top 7 over 70 award for the Calgary area. And in September 2019, she was awarded the $250,000 Dr. Rogers Prize for career contributions to complementary and alternative medicine for all of Canada. For more information, please visit her website, www.bonniejkaplan.com. Dr. Kaplan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was fiddling with the view because I don't particularly like to have my own face on the screen when I'm talking, and I lost it totally. So may I just ask you, is it dark or can you see me okay? Or I don't know what I did.
Yes, we can see you and your slides.
That's all that matters. And it's much more important that you can see the slides. Well, thank you, everybody. And I want to start out by thanking the lovely people who've been holding my hand throughout this. Danelda, first of all, Karen, Michael, Nate, etc. Of course, Nate, because we have to have tech is very important to us all these days. So you've been great, and it's a real pleasure to speak to this group. It was such an amazing honor to receive the Dr. Rogers Prize, but I want you to notice the title of my talk. It doesn't say CAM, because I actually felt a little twinge of guilt when I received the Dr. Rogers Prize. Not enough to walk away from it, but I don't think of nutrition as CAM. I think of nutrition as basic biology, as building our cells, as what we are made of, or as I say in the title of this talk, really it's the basis of our health and our brain health. And also, as Dr. Heather Tick said yesterday in that really excellent talk, our nutrients are also the essence of how we deal with all kinds of assaults on us, toxins and inflammation and so forth. So again, it's foundational, and that's the orientation of what I want to talk to you about today. So my first slide is just a traditional disclosure slide. I have no commercial interest in any company or the sale of any product. This is a little overview. I've been using this kind of overview recently in my lectures, starting out with the bad news and going on to talking a little bit about how the brain uses nutrients, and then going to the good news and ending with practical ideas. That's what I'm going to be doing today. So here, I'm going to hit you right between the eyes with the first bad news slide. When this came out, data from the Canadian Community Health Survey data, I couldn't believe my eyes. Little did I know that there was American data showing very similar thing. In order to understand this slide, it doesn't matter. We don't even have to name the quote food that's on the screen. The important thing to know is that it is kind of the lowest of the low. It's what we call UPF, or ultra processed food. And you all know that there's ultra processed food And at the other end of the continuum is real food, whole food, true food, whatever you want to call it. But there are many shades of gray, and there are all kinds of minor processing that happens to food that is sometimes quite acceptable. For example, an apple is best, but frankly, applesauce, even purchased, not homemade, it might have a little bit of a preservative in it, but otherwise it still is fairly nutritious. So there are levels of processing, but half of what Canadians are putting into their mouths is ultra processed, meaning it's virtually free of anything like vitamins, minerals, the macronutrients, omega-3 fatty acids, etc. It's filling the stomach, but that is all it's doing. So we need to ask, what do we know about what happens to people whose, now I'm going to be emphasizing micronutrients. I get tired of saying minerals and vitamins. So micronutrient intake. What happens to people where their micronutrient intake is only half of what it could or should be? And I'd like to just point out that this is not a unique finding. Recent data from both Canada and the US, and I can give you the references if you want, show that less than 10% of our population eats the recommended number of daily fruit and vegetable servings. And one publication, you may have seen this, had amazing financial implications by increasing just one serving of fruit or vegetable per day. Based on extrapolations from the data they had collected, we would be saving as a nation over $9 billion in healthcare costs. Now, the focus of that was on physical health, as it usually is, but that's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? But that's not how we're eating. So what's going on? What happens to people who eat only half of the nutrients that they think they should be, or that we think they should be getting? So what do these sound like? Depression, you know what that is. Hysteria is kind of an old-fashioned term for maybe high anxiety or even a little hypomania. Irritability, self-harm, we would call it now, etc. What's on this slide are basically most of the symptoms of depression, anxiety, and some of ADHD. But this is what it really is. At the University of Minnesota 70 years ago, when they did the starvation experiments after World War II, they had 36 normal, healthy men who agreed to go on to a 50% caloric and nutrient intake diet, and they did that for 6 months. And this is what was expressed. It was not surprising to anyone, because anyone who has worked in a developing world or in tremendous crisis, people who are pushed out of their homes because of war, etc., whose nutrient intake goes way down, you see these symptoms. So we have known for 70 years that the mental health impact of cutting nutrient intake by 50% involves mental health symptoms. And this is what our entire population is doing right now. But the bad news isn't over. What if, even in that 50%, we were getting fewer minerals and vitamins than our ancestors did? Now, I'm not going to go into this in great depth, and I have half a chapter in a book that I have that's coming out for people who are interested in all the agricultural issues related to the quality of our food supply. But just a general reminder for those of you who haven't heard this maybe in recent years or haven't thought about it, we need to have our soil very well mineralized with about 15 minerals in order for plants to grow in a very healthy manner. And when they do that, the plants synthesize approximately, well, they provide to us, they synthesize vitamins and provide it with roughly 15 minerals and 15 vitamins. We cannot do this. I cannot absorb minerals from soil, as far as I know, and we cannot synthesize vitamins except the very small amount of B vitamins that even you could say we are not manufacturing them. They're actually our gut bugs. Our microbiome, a healthy microbiome, will provide you a bit of the B vitamins, but otherwise we depend upon plants that are grown in healthy soil. We then come along and we eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants, but this is how we get our minerals and vitamins. More bad news. I haven't said this, but let me just say, if you want to know about the things that are affecting our food supply, you need to learn about glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. You need to learn about other insecticides, and you also should learn about how climate change is decreasing the nutrient content of our food. It's very worrisome. But I'm going to go on. I want to talk about why we should focus on mental health. And this is another bad news story. So E. Fuller Torrey, who's a very senior psychiatrist in the US, wrote this book called The Invisible Plague. And what he and Judy Miller reported was that in 1750, the best data that they could put together showed that 1 in 10,000 people, from data collected around the world, 1 in 10,000 people qualified for a mental disorder. And by 1960, it had tripled. And it was based on that tripling to 3 in 10,000 that they entitled their book, The Invisible Plague. They thought that was a plague. I've actually written to Dr. Torrey, who's in his 90s now, and he has not replied because I'm curious to know what he thinks about now. If 3 in 10,000 was a plague, what in the world? This is the World Health Organization data showing point prevalence of 2,500 in 10,000. And by the way, the lifetime prevalence is 50%. So what is going on? Well, many things, but some of us think that nutrition is one of them. So the take-home message from all this bad news is that mental health problems are really epidemic. Conventional treatments are not helping enough. Now, I want to say I am not opposed. Just because I think nutrition is important doesn't mean that I don't think there is a place for psychiatric medication. I think there is. It's just that I think that it is the supplement. Nutrition should be the primary treatment. At any rate, regardless of what you think about conventional treatments, including psychotherapy, CBT, etc., they aren't doing enough, because if they were, the rates would be going down, and they're just going way, way up. And that data was pre-COVID, by the way. Okay, so we know that it's gotten worse. So it's time to move on. No more bad news. We can all start smiling a little bit, because I'm going to show you some really interesting things, if you have not thought about them since you were in school, about what our brain does and how it uses nutrients. Our brain is very tiny. It weighs only about 1 kilogram. Think about what you weigh. Most anybody listening to me here weighs, I think, more than 50 kilograms probably. And so our brain is really a small portion of our entire brain and body, but it uses up way out of proportion the amount of oxygen and nutrients that we feed it. It is a very metabolically demanding organ. And in fact, another way to look at this is that each of us has about 6 liters of blood inside us, and around 1 liter is passing through your tiny little brain every 60 seconds that your heart is beating. So why have we evolved to need that much blood going through a tiny little organ? It's way more than any other organ in our body. Why have we evolved to need so many nutrients every minute? Well, I'm not going to talk about oxygen here, okay? And this brings us to what's going on in the brain, called brain metabolism, which is a word that just means the transformation of one compound to another. Chemical A needs to be transformed or metabolized to chemical B billions of times a minute in your brain. How does this happen? Well, to get from A to B, you have to have an enzyme, because these are enzymatic reactions that are going on. But you don't get to chemical B unless you are supplying your enzyme all the cofactors that it needs for that particular step, and every step is unique. What are the cofactors? They're minerals and vitamins, and that's how you get to chemical B. I'm going to illustrate this with a little bit of tryptophan to serotonin conversion, but I could also show you dopamine or any other neurotransmitter set of pathways. And this is not the entire serotonin pathway. This is a tiny, tiny little piece of it. And I've put in red tryptophan because you would recognize the name, and serotonin because you know that, and melatonin because it's a byproduct that you would be familiar with. But you don't need to worry about these other chemicals. They are simply steps in metabolism. What you can do is you can look at every arrow as an enzymatic reaction, which is what they are, and you can click on them online and find out which cofactors are necessary for that reaction to happen. So in the first one, right here, it requires iron, phosphorus, and calcium. So to break down tryptophan to 5-hydroxyl-tryptophan, every minute of the day, in order to get over here to serotonin, you have to be supplying your brain with enough iron, phosphorus, and calcium. Over here, you need B6. And by the way, B6 is very frequent in this particular chart. Here you need 2 B vitamins and iron. Here you need B6 again. Over here you need niacin, riboflavin, and molybdenum, which is a trace mineral most people don't even think about or haven't heard of. Zinc, which is a plays a major role in all kinds of enzymatic pathways in our brain. Iron and niacin, etc., etc., etc. You will not find a metabolic step in the brain, to the best of my knowledge, that is not completely dependent for its efficiency on minerals and vitamins. And this should be taught in school. I think it should be taught in elementary school, but I sure as heck wish it were at least taught in medical school, because then I wouldn't be getting physicians saying to me, Bonnie, vitamins and minerals, they don't really affect how the brain works, do they? And this happens to me regularly. So these nutrients have to come from somewhere. And by the way, when you look at a diagram like that, the serotonin, that part of the serotonin pathway, I hope you realize that it's wishful thinking that we're ever going to find a single nutrient that's going to somehow have a major impact on brain function. There is no single nutrient, and Mother Nature knows that. That's why our minerals and vitamins and omega-3 fatty acids and so forth, they're packaged together, nicely balanced, so that you get the things together that need to be consumed together. So this is where we get it, of course, and that is from a good diet. So the point of all this so far is to explain to you that the role of nutrients in the brain is not a mystery. And I've been talking about metabolism because to me it's so fundamental, and I think it's so neglected. Dr. Tick yesterday mentioned a bit about inflammation, and everybody wants to talk about inflammation. Guess what you can do first and foremost to manage chronic excessive inflammation? As Dr. Tick said, you eat a healthy diet. If you want optimal mitochondrial function, what you do is improve your diet, because that is how you have more ATP production. And I don't have time to go into that further. You might be relieved at that. I'm going to move on to another topic, but I can send anyone this article if they're interested in a little summary article on it. Now, I just want to say, I'm going to be emphasizing minerals and vitamins. Now, partly that's because that's what I studied most in my career, but also because I think they're dismissed much too easily. The fact is that essential fatty acids like the omega-3s are extremely important, especially for cellular development, as everybody on this call would know, and for their the anti-inflammatory effects of DHA and EPA. This is very important, but people tend to dismiss the role of minerals and vitamins. In fact, I have personally encountered people who became very, very well taking nutrients in pill form, which some people call supplements. I have trouble with that word, as I said, because to me, medication should be the supplement. But anyway, I will use that word today. And they've become very dismissive when they've gotten better because they were just vitamins. In fact, the majority of people I talk to, I think, refer to as, oh, it's just vitamins. What do you mean, just vitamins? It's what our cells are dependent on every minute of every day, and the minerals too, don't forget them. So I just want to mention, before I go on to the next part of the talk, mention something I don't have time to go into, but thanks to the interest of Brenda Leung, who's, I'm pretty sure, on this call, in this audience, we created a longitudinal pregnancy and birth cohort in Alberta called APRN, the Alberta Pregnancy Outcome and Nutrition. I have it on the next slide. Alberta Pregnancy Outcomes and Nutrition Pregnancy and Birth Cohort. And the focus of that is on the prenatal intrauterine nutritional environment as a predictor of all kinds of things in the mother and in the offspring. The offspring of APRN are now 8 years old. Brenda she had a lot to do with forming this when she was my PhD student, but now she's a co-investigator, and I've stepped down and retired. But if you want to know, I think there are about 110 publications from that already. And if you want to know more about that particular aspect of nutrition and brain development and brain function, you can look at the apronstudy.ca website. But I'm going to go on. I could spend 3 days with you, but I only have 45 minutes. So we've talked about the good news, and now I want to say the best news of all. Because nutrition is the foundation of our resilience, this is an extremely good piece of news and should make clinicians feel empowered to help their clients more. Diet is a modifiable risk factor. And I say this to psychiatrists and clinical psychologists all the time. You cannot change the family constellation. You're not going to fix the, whatever, alcoholic father, the other problems going on in their lives. But this is something you can do. You can improve their resilience by doing something about modifiable dietary factors. Now, in this part of this talk, I'm going to go pretty quickly over 4 kinds of data to show the importance of this area. And I do tend to talk a little fast sometimes. If I go too quickly, you want to have questions. I think you're going to have the slides or a recording of this afterwards, and you can also look at my website or email me. I'll give you all that at the end, okay? Actually, I said I'm going to go over 4. We really already covered the first one, right? The University of Minnesota starvation experiments showed very convincingly, that nutrient deprivation creates mental health symptoms. Let's move on then to the other 3 areas: correlation, prediction, and treatment outcome studies. I'm going to be a little superficial in the correlational studies because that's all they deserve. We have done correlation to death in diet and mental health. The Mediterranean whole foods diet in at least a dozen or more, 15 population health studies, is associated with lower rates of mood and anxiety symptoms. And the Western processed foods diet is associated with higher rates of mood and anxiety symptoms. So I wish funding agencies would stop funding them, and I wish journals would stop publishing them. Correlational studies are important for creating basically hypotheses that need to be tested then for causality and so forth. But it just feels like this is everybody's favorite thesis topic or something. This is something maybe where there is room for more research. There's a bit of research only from Australia and Canada showing that this relationship can be demonstrated down to the age of 11, which I find that so disturbing. I think that there should be a bit more work there because, I mean, what are we doing to our children? When they can self-report that their worries and their fears are at a certain level, and you can show that that's correlated with what they're eating, you have to wonder why we're not educating our public more about this. But that's a political issue we're not going to get into today. Why the media doesn't pay attention to the research I'm talking about. This is a note to clinicians, and again, it's kind of a good news story. I don't always show this study. This is from my former PhD student, Karen Davison, who's now on faculty and so is Brenda Leung, who I just mentioned. So these are 2 people who are pursuing research in nutrition, which is great. But this is from Karen's PhD thesis, and she had a lot of hypotheses, and this is one where I said she would find nothing. I was quite wrong. She had 97 community living adults whose diagnoses of a mood disorder had been really rigorously confirmed, but they were only mildly dysfunctional, right? I mean, they were pretty functional. They were living out in the community. They were living fairly independently. They were almost all taking psychiatric meds, and they were able to participate in research that required them to record everything they ate for 3 days. So that tells you that they were only mildly or moderately symptomatic. So Karen evaluated their food records for 7 vitamins and minerals, and we wanted to know if in those 3 days there was a relationship between their food intake and how they felt. And I couldn't believe it, that in just 3 days, every single nutrient of the 7 vitamins, 7 minerals, 1 was not correlated, and that was sodium. No surprise there, but every single one of them was significantly correlated with global assessment of functioning. And the reason I put the minerals in a box is I wouldn't do a statistical test on this because the sample size is too small, but there is an obvious tendency, I think, for the minerals to be more highly correlated. So I always have friends saying, Bonnie, I took my vitamins today. And I always say, good, what about your minerals? I think we underappreciate the importance of minerals for mood. At any rate, this was fascinating to me, and I like to show it when I think there are some clinicians in the audience, because what it says is that even in people who are medicated, still not doing very well, but functioning adequately, you may find that they feel better if they pay attention to improving their diet. So the first two things we've demonstrated now, that we just reviewed the correlational data. Let's move on to predictive studies. These are very important because if you just show a correlation between, say, an ultra-processed diet and depression, you don't know, I mean, someone out in the audience will inevitably raise their hand and say, well, maybe they're just eating a bad diet because they're depressed. Because I've never heard of anybody who, when they feel depressed, go and stuff their plate with broccoli and greens and stuff. It's just not the way we eat. It's not what we call comfort food. So it's very important to demonstrate that dietary pattern predicts the emergence of symptoms to show the direction of causation. I hope that's clear. So I usually use this study from Spain, from the University of Navarro, to illustrate this. There aren't that many longitudinal prospective studies because they're really a lot more difficult to do. You have to track large samples for a long period of time. And in this case, this is part of the PrediMed group, which is mostly oriented toward physical health and nutrition. But this is a segment where they were looking at depression and anxiety, and they had semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaires, and they had people who at study entry had no symptoms of depression or anxiety. That's really important. And what happened when they sat back and watched, oh, sorry, one more slide. This is how they characterized the dietary pattern. Commercial baked goods were quantified, fast foods were quantified, and they were put together into an unhealthy diet score. And then they divided people into thirds. So the lowest tertile were the people who ate the least amount of baked goods and fast foods, and that's on this next slide. And they were assigned a risk of depression of 1.0. That's just, an assigned number. And then they had the people who had the highest intake of the processed food. And they had, as you can see, a much greater rate of depression. This was 6.2 years later in about 9,000 people. But so that's an important finding. I mean, what they're saying is dietary pattern predicted the onset of depression. But what's also interesting to me is this middle group. Maybe because I like to think I'm in it, because many of you are too, probably. We might like to have a chocolate chip cookie occasionally or whatever. The point is, I don't think you have to be a purist all the time. It's okay to eat some processed food as long as you are not taking away from your consumption of the healthy food. I'm going to show you one other predictive study because this one has not gotten the attention that it deserves. It's an amazing study from Japan with 90,000 adults. They were surveyed at baseline, 5 years and 10 years, and very thorough medical history, etc., including dietary habits. And then they had access for the whole country to the government records of the cause of death. Now, they divided people into 3 different dietary patterns, and basically they were based on processed versus unprocessed food, but also with kind of an Asian twist. And I'll just show you the one finding about what predicted the rate of suicide. And that was a prudent diet, which is a term often used to describe a whole foods or Mediterranean style diet, was protective. People who ate a prudent diet had the lowest rate of suicide. And that's a very, very dramatic change. And you can see why I think people should be paying more attention to it. What's important here is that they had a high intake of vegetables and fruits, but as I said, there was a little bit of an Asian twist: soy products, seaweed, mushrooms, fish. But that is what really distinguished the group. So much for predicting emergence of symptoms. I think there's enough research. I didn't cover it all by any means, but there's enough research now to suggest that when people's dietary habits are going downhill, as been shown in one Australian study in teenagers where they shift over 2 years toward a more processed diet, they are putting themselves at risk for mental health problems. So let's go on to treatment. There are not too many studies of whole diet approach, and they can never be placebo controlled because I don't know what placebo you would give them for a whole diet, but you can use an active comparator, and that's what the SMILES study did. Of all the studies that I'm showing you today, I think this is the only one I ever saw the media cover a little bit. So you might have seen this one. It's from Felice Jacka in Australia. They had 67 adults with major depressive disorder who also had a poor diet, and you can guess what that meant. Basically, not much in the way of fruits and vegetables and fish, etc. And they were randomized to 12 weeks of dietary counseling or peer counseling. So no placebo, no blinding is possible, but a very different kind of experience. And there were several interesting findings from the study. But first of all, have to make sure that everybody in this audience knows what I mean by a prudent or a whole foods or a Mediterranean kind of diet, and you will recognize what this is. So up here we have fruits and vegetables, fish once or twice a week, meat, assuming you're not a vegan or vegetarian, of course, dairy and eggs, whole grains, olive oil for your oil, and then in the center, pardon me, are the beans, lentils, etc., which are so important. And I'll come back to them. So the first finding is really interesting. I've had psychiatrists say to me that I can't teach my patients anything about diet because they're so depressed. They just don't have the mental energy to try to change their diet. And so this, to me, is a very important finding, is that diet modification is possible. And of course, it's also therapeutic, or we wouldn't be talking about the results, I guess, although, boy, that implies that I'm cherry picking. There are no negative results that I am intentionally not, ignoring. That came out all wrong. Okay. These are two separate but very interesting findings. First of all, let's talk about remission. That means not just better, not just that your depression lightens, but it gets so much better, you no longer meet criteria for major depression. And this first line is really important. It's why psychotherapists do what they do. It's why you do what you do for your friends and relatives who are having a down day, because counseling, support, etc., is really important. Network, family, social support, it's all very important. This, of course, is the blockbuster finding, though. Again, it's not just that people got better who got the dietary counseling, but a third of them went into remission. And I've never heard of an antidepressant drug coming anywhere close to that. I mean, remission and also no side effects, right? And also, those whose diets improved the most showed the most improvement in mood. And that was replicated especially by Natalie Parletta the same year, where she looked at the relationship between the quantity of change and the quantity of mood improvement. And then Heather Francis published one that used an online video education for the dietary intervention. And the finding kind of knocks my socks off. That should be replicated in itself, because the implications of that for public health are really enormous, that people don't even need one-on-one education, that you can tell them to go watch a video after giving them information and the rationale, of course. And here's the final finding that came from the SMILES trial that doesn't surprise me, but surprises a lot of people, because I know I've spoken to large audiences of psychiatrists and other kinds of clinicians, and they're always telling me, my patients can't afford to eat whole food. And I've known for a while that individual people have told me that they save money eating a whole foods diet, but this was pardon me, shown in the SMILES trial. These are Australian dollars. Prior to intervention, that's what they were spending. And after intervention with the recommended diet, that's what they were spending. And this is why. You can, first of all, the variety of things that you can cook with dried peas and beans and lentils is enormous. You put one of these into Google, any one of them with the word recipe, and I guarantee you'll have over 3 million recipes in less than 1 minute. I know, because I've tried. So, and they're cheap. You can buy large bags for very small amounts of money. And so these are the healthy sources of protein and fiber and minerals and vitamins, and they are also a cost savings. I should just say one more thing. There are people who equate the Mediterranean diet with eating, lobster, steak, lots of meat, lots of expensive fish. It doesn't have to. And so people need to be educated about that. Okay, last part of treatment that I need to talk about is why should we even consider supplements? If we can get a 33% treatment benefit just teaching people to eat better, isn't that enough? And my answer is no, it's not enough. We have very good reason to believe that there are some people who have, it's been shown in various inborn errors of metabolism, they've inherited the need for additional cofactors for those enzymatic reactions. And we all know this is true. Think of the individual differences. Everybody who's worked in this area has seen people who already eat a really healthy diet, but then when they add additional nutrient supplements in pill form, their mental health gets better. Similarly, there are some people, I think I'm one, I think I could eat junk for a long time and I would feel awful and get fat and everything. But I don't think I've never experienced depression or anxiety to any, reasonable amount. And so I think probably I would be resistant to that. So these are, and it isn't in my family. These are things that are inherited. And Linus Pauling said that in 1968. He said, probably the cause of mental illness, which of course has been a mystery for millennia, relates to the inheritance of how we metabolize the essential nutrients in the brain. And I think that's what we're finding out is exactly true. Now, to keep this simple, because I don't have that much time left, I'm going to talk about nutrients in pill form in two categories. And the first one is in people who do not have mental symptoms, and it's the use of B complex. B complex is underappreciated for improving resilience to stress. There have been at least 10 randomized controlled trials that have, and by the way, you can use placebos when you're studying nutrients in pill form. So that's a little bit stronger than some of the dietary whole diet research. B complex decreases stress and anxiety in your just any old population of students who volunteer for your study or in really stressed populations. And I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. But that's B complex. I have never heard anyone even anecdotally say that B complex is enough to get rid of, depression or generalized anxiety disorder or ADHD or whatever. But it's very good for improving resilience to stress. But for evidence of benefit for more serious, if you will, mental symptoms in clinical samples, people with depression, bipolar, ADHD, etc., everything you see on this page, the only thing that has really been useful are broad spectrum formulas. And I'll explain what I mean. There are 3 broad spectrum formulas in the world that I know of, which have been studied by scientists who are not funded by the manufacturers. Now, you have to understand how unique that is. Every single psychiatric drug that I have ever heard of has been studied by people who were funded to do the research by the drug company. In fact, they even usually run the study and sometimes write up the papers. So the people who have been studying broad spectrum formulas did not want to go, and I'm one of them, didn't want to go down that pathway of corruption of the literature with that with money from companies. And so none of us is affiliated with any of the companies. Two of the three companies are Canadian, and that's True Hope and Hardy Nutritionals, and their broad spectrum formulas are very similar because they started out as one company and then they split into two. And what I mean by broad spectrum for them is, remember I talked about the 15 minerals and the 15 vitamins roughly? Depends on how you count them and whether you consider choline a vitamin or not, things like that. But at any rate, roughly 30 minerals and vitamins. That's what both of them have. And the third one is from Arizona, and it has been studied primarily in autism, and that's because it was developed at the Autism Research Center. The evidence base for the benefit in mental disorders, I'm not going to talk about single nutrient studies. After looking at my serotonin slide, you know why. I mean, I've written a review paper going back to the 1920s if you want to read how modest the effects of single nutrient treatment has been. Currently, everybody's picking their favorite few. I never know quite what to call that, but people will do a study and get money for it and publish it with like 5 micronutrients and say, oh, look, there wasn't much benefit for, bipolar disorder or whatever. And one of them even entitled, there is more is not merrier, because they want to what we know about what the price that they see little benefit. The broad spectrum formulas, on the other hand, well, there are more than 50 peer-reviewed publications showing mental health benefit. So I cannot, they come from Canada, the US, and mostly New Zealand, because my former PhD student, Julia Ruckledge, moved there, and she's had the most active research program in the world on the Alberta formulas. But Brenda Leung in the audience has gotten involved in a very, very interesting multi-center, multi-country trial whose results we are eagerly awaiting soon. At any rate, I'm going to show you a sampling of what you can do with a broad spectrum formula. This is one of the oldest studies where I showed on-off control in a child. You can see the diagnostic categories at the top. And this is published in Journal of Child and Adolescent Psychopharmacology, or I can send it to you if you want to know more about the child involved. There were 2 kids, but this is one. This is his behavior in terms of mood. I shouldn't have said behavior. His mood in terms of baseline, which he was really severely disturbed. He went on to one of the Alberta formulas and his mood improved a lot. The problems dropped way down. Then the formula was taken away for various reasons. Things changed. He went back up. We put him back on the formula and he got better again. Same thing with temper outbursts. And I actually have followed this child. He's now in his 30s and he's doing very, very well and takes good care of his health. So that's great to see. That was an early demonstration. In 2015, Julia Ruckledge's graduate student, Heather Gordon, showed the same thing with a group of 14 school-age children. And this is at baseline, then putting them onto a formula. They went below clinical cutoff, took the formula away, they went back up, down, etc. So you can show on-off control of a lot of symptoms with these things. I'm not going to show you these studies here, but they are published in the British Journal of Psychiatry and Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. Julia Ruckledge and her team showed in 2 placebo-controlled trials very dramatic improvements in people who were given the micronutrients. When they broke the code, they could see that those who met criteria for benefiting, being responders, was almost half, and this is showing substantial improvement, not just a small amount of improvement. In the adults with ADHD, did I say this was an ADHD? I meant to say that. I hope I did. And then in the child trial, it was very, very similar, whereas we always get a big placebo effect. You're giving people large capsules, and so this is the group that got placebo. Okay. I think my next slide is a summary because I don't have time to go into any more of these. These are multi-nutrient placebo-controlled RCTs directed at improving psychological or psychiatric symptoms. And I thank Julia Ruckledge for putting this slide together. She summarized them this way. The positive sign means that there was a statistical benefit. So there were 5 RCTs on aggression, and all 5 of them were positive. Autism, 2, and both were positive. To mood and PMS, and there are some negative trials. They didn't show a benefit anyway. They weren't adverse effects. Stress, there were many with B complex, but for the broad spectrum, 8 of the 9 showed positive benefit, etc. And this is the overall result, which is very strong compared to psychiatric meds. But this is the common theme, is that minerals and vitamins improve emotion regulation. You lower explosive rage, irritability, managing anger, etc. Sometimes in clinical, sometimes in non-clinical populations, but clearly the absence of these nutrients in our diets are affecting some people, I think, quite strongly. So I'm going to end by showing you a public health perspective, implications for general population health. And that is our series of post-disaster studies. These are no longer clinical samples. These are not people referred by psychiatrists, okay? Julia lives in Christchurch, New Zealand, where they had major earthquakes in September of 2010 and February of 2011. And after the second major, and 8,000 in between, by the way, aftershocks. So very, very stressed population. And they did a randomized controlled trial where people received either one of the Alberta broad spectrum formulas, that's the red line, B complex, green line, or what the community was offering, treatment as usual, which was support, medication, etc. And that's the kind of brownish line, brownish red. And this is baseline, and at week 1, 2, 3, etc. How do you interpret that? Well, this is the clinical cutoff. So what this shows is that in 1 week, the group getting broad spectrum or B complex, remember, they're not a clinical sample, they're from the general population. In 1 week, that group was almost completely below clinical cutoff, but not treatment as usual. And in fact, if you follow it out to the full 4 weeks, the 2 groups getting the active treatments were doing very well, but treatment as usual not. And even a year later, there's a difference. So then, probable PTSD, right? She had a measure of probable PTSD, and it dropped in 4 weeks from 68% to 19% in those who were getting the broad spectrum micronutrient formula. Think about the cost savings possible if we could get our Veterans Affairs Department, which I've tried to get their attention, to pay attention to this, because clearly resilience and bouncing back from PTSD in that kind of situation could be influenced by nutrition. So why do I have such confidence in this? It's because of replication. We had a major flood in 2013 in our area. We did not have 8,000 of them. We had one bad day, okay? But it was pretty bad. And so with Julia, she still had her data collection system online. So we worked together to do an RCT in Calgary. And in this case, we had, again, broad spectrum. Here it's a green line. Whoops, sorry. B complex is the red line. And in 2 weeks, they were below clinical cutoff. We had an active comparator of vitamin D, which we thought might help people a bit, but it was only 1,000 IUs, and so it was really just a comparator. And you can see that they, even in 6 weeks, did not look as good. Now, most recently, this data is not published. It's in a paper that it's in revision that we've written up together. And this is because they had these terrible mosque shootings in March of 2019, where a gunman entered 2 mosques, killed 51 people and injured 49. And it was not possible to get ethics approval for Julia to do an actual study, but they were clinically monitored every 2 weeks. And PTSD went from 77% down to 23%, which is quite similar to what happened after the earthquakes. And so this is a summary slide. I'll put on the normal cutoff. That's this line. This line is after the earthquakes. This line is after the flood, both of them getting broad spectrum micronutrients. The massacre, oh, I just said it exactly wrong. So sorry. I'm sure some of you figured this out. The 3 lines that got broad spectrum micronutrients are down here. And so what this shows, in 4 to 6 weeks, all of them came below clinical cutoff. The 2 groups that did not get below clinical cutoff were the people in the earthquake who had treatment as usual, and the flood comparator, which was vitamin D. So we think that's a pretty strong case to be made for giving people nutrients after a crisis. And then we have the alternative. After the Fort McMurray fires, I won't bore you with the details, but I tried so hard to get our government, our healthcare system, to at least tell people to go take a B complex. Pop a B complex every morning after breakfast on a full stomach. Don't worry if your urine turns bright yellow from the riboflavin, and you will improve resilience in people who've been displaced following forest fires. They wouldn't do it. Psychiatry and dietitians blocked me 100%. And this is what happened. The government then published the data. How surprising. After the forest fires, this is mood disorders skyrocketing. This is anxiety disorders skyrocketing. A little bit of change in substance abuse. I don't know what I would have predicted there. The point is that we could have prevented that, and it cost Alberta a lot of suffering. I'm sure there are people still suffering, and a lot of money, but they wouldn't listen. Okay, I'm going to end with practical suggestions, and I know I started almost 10 minutes late, but I don't know if somebody tell me if I'm going to get totally kicked off here or not. But
you will not.
Not be kicked off, but we'll leave time for a couple questions, going to 10 minutes after my time. So practical suggestions, and I'm only going to give you a couple here because they're downloadable in a PDF on my website if you want to take a look. I just want to say this. I know that many of you know people who believe they have gotten so much better from a gluten-free diet, and I'm talking about mental health now, but they might be reporting better physical health too. Paleo diet, ketogenic diet, vegan diet, and so on and so on. But speaking to you as clinicians, putting your clinical hat on, I strongly recommend that you do not encourage patients, clients, to go that route first. And the reason is that they're very restrictive. And people who are trying to change their diets, if they go too restrictive and they feel they fail, end up hating themselves, beating themselves up more, and probably dropping out of your practice and so forth. So I really recommend that it's more practical to teach people about a Mediterranean style whole foods diet. Get the ultra processed food out of their diets first. Then, of course, lots of people will benefit from trying some of these specialty diets. So what do I mean? Of course, teaching people about this and not this, and teaching them that this is a very expensive way to eat, and certainly not this. Okay, so to save money, I really think we should be teaching people not to be afraid of beans and lentils, and teaching them how to cook them. If they cannot afford a pressure cooker or an Instapot or something like that, it's still very possible to cook with these and save a lot of money and be a lot healthier. I'm going to end with something. I have found really a number of physicians, mostly I guess when I've spoken to family doctors, have raised the issue of how do I talk to my patients about this? And it turns out, I think a little bit of their feeling is, well, I'm not perfect in the way I eat, so how can I be telling other people how to eat? But and they are afraid that they'll sound condescending, I think. So actually, it's really very easy to start the conversation. So here's a good way to begin. I think that every clinician in specialty could say to every patient, every client, there's an increasing amount of scientific data showing that what we eat influences how we feel. Let's talk about your diet. You're not being judgmental. And then you could use these 4 questions that I've adapted from Amy Paxton's Start the Conversation from University of North Carolina. The important thing is, notice they're about fast food, sodas, fruit, and vegetables, but you don't score it. There's no scoring, and there's no right or wrong answer, because what people if you go through these, and when you get to say sodas, people will say, oh, I know I drink too much, blah, 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 and I tried to cut back, blah, blah. But it is a way to open the door for conversation. And then you can talk about, well, let's talk how we can maybe taper down more gradually. And in fact, I guess I didn't show it. One of the ways on that particular one, sodas, there are people who find it easier to transition from, say, Cokes and stuff like that onto carbonated water as an interim step. And the carbonated waters without sugar or artificial sugars, and then gradually move on to tea or whatever. So there are ways that you can gradually transition from eating, one piece of fruit every 2 weeks to trying to eat one piece of fruit every Friday, or having a certain kind of vegetables every other day or something like that. So my time definitely is up now, and we'll have some time for questions. Here are the resources. Email me, my website. The Better Brain is a book that Julia Ruckledge and I have just finished, and it'll be published in a few months from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and you can pre-order it now. But if you just want to take a look on the website, you'll learn more about it. We really cover the field of nutrition and mental health, not physical health, mental health. But you can also ask me for slides, etc. Part of the income from the sale of that book is going to be supporting the two charitable funds that I established, one in the US and one in Canada, where I have raised over $850,000, but it's all gone, folks. Some of the Dr. Rogers Prize is going in that direction also, and already has done. But it's supporting clinical trials in all 3 countries where there have been scientists interested in pursuing the use of micronutrients and dietary treatments to improve mental health. So that's me and my resources, and